Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Robert Daly. I direct the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States here at the Wilson Center. And we have a number of old friends here this morning, but we also have some, I think, first-time visitors to the Wilson Center. So I should note that the center is named, of course, for President Woodrow Wilson, who was to date the only American president to have earned a PhD. And this as the National Memorial to Wilson, we were founded in '68 by Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Congress, chartered by Congress, to be a place that would bring together American and international scholars and to give them a chance to have their scholarship have an impact on, or at least be heard by, policymakers. And so this was not seen as a think tank at the time. It was seen as a center for scholarly research, which we remain to this day. But we have also begun to style ourselves as a think tank, and we're very interested in having an impact on policy. And so I was delighted when one of this year's Wilson Fellows, Michael Davis, brought this opportunity to our attention, and we are thrilled to be able to welcome Martin Li Zhuming, to the Wilson Center for, I believe, the first time. Is that correct, sir? You haven't been here before. I have been here now for about 5.5 years. I don't think I have ever said that one of our speakers required no introduction, in part because it's a tired cliche, but also because it's best to err on the side of introducing people. But I think that today this is true. You, of course, know that Martin Li is a Hong Kong politician, lawyer, and tireless advocate for democracy and human rights in Hong Kong, and has been carrying out that advocacy and that leadership now for many decades. He was the founding chairman of United Democrats of Hong Kong and the Hong Kong Democratic Party, and served as a member of the Legislative Council from 1985 to 97, and again from 98 to 2008. Where he served, I believe, with Margaret Ng, who's also with us today, a former member of LegCo, and we look forward to any questions or comments that you may have as well. Are there any other members of of your delegation who are with us this morning? The two. Okay. Well, welcome. We're very glad to have you with us today. Martin Li was chairman of the Hong Kong Bar Association from 1980 to 1983, and got involved early on in the drafting of Hong Kong's basic law. And that was really when his advocacy and political leadership began. Currently, he is leading the fight against proposed amendments to Hong Kong's fugitive ordinance law, which has been introduced by the government of Hong Kong. He met yesterday with Secretary of State Pompeo to discuss this issue, and has also on this trip testified before the Congressional Executive Commission on China, and has been meeting other lawmakers all over town. To give you some sense of the importance of the proposed amendments to the laws to the United States, Senator Marco Rubio, who is the Republican co-chairman of the Executive Commission on China, said that it was because of this that he was going to be reintroducing the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. And there is another side to the issue, which was raised by Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey, who said that if Hong Kong is to become just another mainland Chinese city, the implication being that the passage of this law would push it in that direction, we will have, this is Smith, we will have to reassess whether Hong Kong warrants special status under U.S. law. So we'd like to use the opportunity of having Martin Li here today to hear about his trip and the issue that you're very focused on now, but also to look more broadly at what American interests national interests in Hong Kong are now. And we have therefore invited Stapleton Roy, Ambassador Roy, who also needs no introduction, to carry out a dialogue with Martin Li before we open it up to the group. Ambassador Roy was the founding director of the Kissinger Institute here at the Wilson Center and is now a distinguished fellow. And he, of course, served as American ambassador to China for 4 years under Presidents Bush and Clinton, but also as ambassador to Indonesia and Singapore during his very long career in the Foreign Service, in which Hong Kong has also played a role. So we look forward to a dialogue between the two of them. I'd like to invite Martin Lee to begin, maybe with an overview of your trip and the issues you're focused on now, before we turn it over to the two of you. Sir.
Thank you. It's going to be a very exciting experience for me. I've been an advocate for 53 years now, and I always like to cross-examine people. Today, I'm about to be cross-examined by an ambassador. Now, what would a little mouse do if there are two elephants fighting close to it? Well, Hong Kong is a little mouse. The two giants are now having this trade war. And so people ask us, what are you doing here? It is good that you have reminded us of this US-Hong Kong Policy Act. Now that act was very important for Hong Kong. It was passed into a law here in 1992. And it was strictly based on the Sino-British Joint Declaration made between Britain and China in 1984 and embodied in the Basic Law. What is called China's Basic Policies regarding Hong Kong, which is one country, two systems, Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong with a high degree of autonomy. And if you look at the Joint Declaration, it's clearly stated that apart from defense and foreign affairs, Hong Kong would be given that high degree of autonomy in executive, legislative, and judicial power. And they actually changed the Hong Kong system a little from what it was as a British colony. It allowed Hong Kong to set up our Court of Final Appeal, because until that arrangement, all the final appeals from Hong Kong would be in the Privy Council in London. So that is a very important provision. And so when the two giants are fighting, I do say that the attention of your government should be on that act which binds it. And it must look at Hong Kong as a totally different entity from mainland China. We have different systems of law. We believe in the core values, which are shared by many in your country: the rule of law, freedoms, particularly religious freedom, press freedom, and so on. And Hong Kong, therefore, is a key to China as far as your government is concerned. And my dream for China is not that Hong Kong will continue to prosper and be stable under this policy of one country, two systems, but that ultimately all the Chinese people, the 1.4 billion now, will enjoy as much freedoms as we have and have the rule of law which we have. And that is my dream. So I would call on your government and Congress and everybody here to treat Hong Kong and to defend Hong Kong, to make sure that what we have will continue to be enjoyed by our people, so that one day all our compatriots in China may also enjoy the same.
Thank you. Steve.
Thank you for a opening statement that gets us right into the issues that I would like to explore with you. I was a U.S. diplomat for 45 years, and my shortest assignment was in Hong Kong, only 5 months. But my parents lived in Hong Kong for nearly 20 years. My father helped establish the Chinese University of Hong Kong and was one of its first vice presidents for several years. So during my assignments in East Asia, I always considered Hong Kong to be my second home because my parents were there, and I would often go and spend Christmas and Thanksgiving with them. So I've been interested in Hong Kong for a long time. it's very clear that Hong Kong's relationship with mainland China is a vitally important factor in looking at the future of Hong Kong. But it's equally true that the U.S. relationship with mainland China is also very important in terms of Hong Kong's future. And I would like to explore those areas a little bit because they don't get enough attention. For example, we have the U.S. Hong Kong Policy Act, which expresses the fact that we do indeed have an interest in whether Hong Kong develops democratically the way that was foreseen in the joint statement of 1984 and in the language of the Basic Act. And it's important to realize that you were introduced as a lawyer. And that doesn't capture it, because under British law, you have to distinguish between barristers and solicitors, and you were a barrister. So you were the type of lawyer that we associate with law, which is somebody who advocates positions and can appear before courts.
Trial lawyer.
That's a trial lawyer. And you were involved in the negotiation of the joint statement of 1984, and you also were on the committee that
Basic law, yeah.
that was drafting the basic law, and so you're a true expert in those areas. But the United States, on the one hand, has an interest in Hong Kong, but on the other hand, we take actions with the People's Republic of China that are not necessarily in Hong Kong's best interest. Mm-hmm. And that contradiction is not reflected in the way that we think about our relationships with China. And I'd like to bring out some of that contradictory aspects of our approach, because you meet with members of Congress who tell you how important Hong Kong is to us, but we totally ignore Hong Kong when we decide how to deal with mainland China. For example, could you comment a bit on how our trade war with Beijing is affecting Hong Kong's interests? There's a potential for the trade war to be an extended one. There's a potential for it to involve even more hundreds of billions of trade with China. Hong Kong's economic future is closely tied to, of course, how China's economy functions. Could you address that for us?
Yeah. Often, when I come here on Hong Kong issues, the question I'm faced with is, "Oh, Mr. Lee, you have come at the wrong time, because there is too much on our China plate." But I say, okay, but what about the Hong Kong plate? It's one country, two systems. And the U.S. Hong Kong Policy Act, in fact, requires you to provide the Hong Kong plate. It may be smaller, but I don't see anything on it. That is the problem. You're absolutely right. People will look at U.S. relationship with China, the two elephants, the little mouse. It's often forgotten. And that's why we're here, to remind people, look, Hong Kong already has the freedoms that we are proud of, that we treasure, and the rule of law. If you don't defend them, what we already have, we're going to lose them. How does it benefit your relationship with China when the only Chinese city which is free loses its freedom? And if we can preserve all these things, which is the basic principle behind one country, two systems, if we can keep all that, the chances are that one day you'll be dealing with a democratically elected China. That must be in your long-term interest. So if you look at little Hong Kong as the key to China, then I suggest it will help you in forming the correct relationship with China. Because I suppose if China is always under the dictatorship of a party, one party, it's very difficult for you to negotiate with them. Whatever important matters you face in international relationships, very often you find China on the other side. North Korea, anywhere. So people here need to be reminded that Hong Kong must be treated separately. And it is a requirement of your own law.
I completely understand the point you were making. But as you say, Hong Kong is a small mouse. And China is a big dragon. And despite what you get told by people here in Washington, the fact of the matter is the way that we deal with the dragon has a much bigger impact on Hong Kong's future than the language of the U.S. Hong Kong Policy Act. That just happens to be the reality. But I don't recall reading a single article in our newspapers here. I'm sure the South China Morning Post and other newspapers have covered this issue on how our trade war with China is affecting Hong Kong's interests. And I wonder if you could comment on that issue so that we have some sense of how our handling of our relationship with the big dragon is affecting the little mouse.
Well, it's very difficult for anybody to give you a correct answer. That's why you don't read about these things. Yeah. Because, of course, we observe the index, the Hang Seng index for shares, right? Stock in shares. Whenever there's visibly a bigger fight, and then you see the index dropping. And when they seem to be reaching an agreement, you see the index coming up. Now, that's easy. But other than that, how much money is it going to actually cost Hong Kong at the end of the year? We just don't know. We just keep watching. That's why you don't read about these things. I'm not I'm not a figures man. I don't know about these things. But generally, we can see that people are troubled. Of course, it would have been lovely if U.S. and China are working in a friendly relationship on everything, right? But you know that's impossible. Now, at the moment, while China and USA are engaged in this trade war, we are here. So people say, and in fact, our chief executive, Carrie Lam, said that we are doing something wrong for Hong Kong. We shouldn't be, because it's by coming here and raise our concerns about the changes which are going to be made to our extradition law, and therefore threatening the freedoms of everybody in Hong Kong. She says, this is counterproductive. You are adding trouble to the two governments over this war. Then my answer is simple. Then why did you introduce this bill? Why did you introduce this bill at this time? Why don't you at least postpone it? Put it at the back burner at least. But no, she's trying to rush this thing through our legislature. She wants to do it at the latest, before the summer recess of the Legislative Council, which is the early July. That is at the latest. At the earliest, this could become law in 1 week or 2 weeks. Now, and she's complaining that we are here. See, why should you just look at the trade war, which fluctuates from day to day, and if at the end of the day, let's say you finally agree, okay, then there are a number of agreements to be signed. What good are these agreements to you when China is the other signatory, when China is allowed to break the Sino-British Joint Declaration with impunity? What good is an agreement to you with China? If that international agreement, which is registered with the United Nations, we are told by the Chinese leaders again and again in 1984 and thereafter, what good is the international agreement? And if you don't hold China to this agreement, the trade war will continue, even with these agreements being signed. So don't look at Hong Kong with a short view. Always look further ahead and use that key to China to your advantage.
I think you've given us a very useful perspective on Hong Kong in relation to these larger issues. But let me raise one of the larger issues, which is the U.S. relationship with China. You have expressed the hope that the democratic system in Hong Kong and the democratic trends in Hong Kong could have some impact on the future development of political system in mainland China.
I hope it will.
Well, you could make the argument that by transforming the status of Hong Kong from a British Crown colony to a part of the People's Republic of China, that in fact that has embedded a more democratic system inside of the People's Republic of China. And the Chinese people are wise. If certain Chinese citizens get better political treatment, there is a tendency to want to extend those privileges on a broader scale. And you could make an argument that, in fact, one of the reasons why the People's Republic of China has been skeptical of the pressures for more rapid democratic development in Hong Kong is because that creates forces in mainland China that are awkward for the Chinese Communist Party to deal with. But this now gets into the question of U.S.-China relations. Because when we had an engagement strategy with China, people are claiming that it was intended to try to strengthen such forces in China and that it has failed to do so, and therefore the engagement policy has failed. And you find large segments of our policy community now that is accepting the view that the engagement strategy has failed and that we instead need a harder policy toward China, seeing it as an emerging strategic rival of the United States, and that our policies therefore have to be focused on that. But that has the effect of confirming what Xi Jinping is trying to do inside China, which is convince the Chinese people that Western attitudes and Western influences and Western values are hostile to the interests of the Chinese people. So policy trends in Washington, I would put forward as a subject for discussion, are actually not working in terms of the goal that you yourself have put forward, which is the hope that the democratic trends in Hong Kong could have a greater influence on the future developments in the other parts of China. Could you comment on that?
I entirely understand that view. That's why politics, particularly when it comes to relationship between countries, two big powers of the world, are never easy. I would be naive to say to you, I have an answer. Mm-hmm. And I don't suppose you too have that answer. That's why we are here. Now, of course there are contradictions. The U.S. government's foreign policy is very clear. You support every country, every nation to develop democracy and human rights, right? And the U.S. government has always admired, maybe too much of a word, but certainly you appreciate the freedom and the rule of law we enjoy in Hong Kong. And that is why you make that act to keep Hong Kong separate from mainland China, at least to allow us to keep what we have and not that to be taken back by China. So that is your objective. But on the other hand, you see rightly that China is worried about Hong Kong. China doesn't like these values to be spread to China. And yet, it is also your fundamental foreign policy on China too, that China should one day be democratic. And China should one day allow all the people there to be free. And so you have this inconsistency. As you defend Hong Kong's freedom and democracy, you would like that to be spread to China. And yet you say, but I understand why China doesn't want that. And so where do you stand? So this will go on, a tug of war. You and I will be still doing this tug of war until tomorrow, but then I have to fly away tonight. Now, but therefore make it easy. That thing is going to be, this tug of war will take some months at least. Well, at least a few weeks. But our law can't wait. So let me tell you the consequences of that bill becoming law. Now, at the moment, you have 85,000 US citizens living and working in Hong Kong. Not just business people, but teachers and preachers and so on, and students. Right? And you have something like 1.3 million tourists coming to Hong Kong every year. You have 1,300 corporations. Now, once this bill becomes law, the extradition arrangements will completely change. Let me tell you what happens today. It may be surprising to a number of you here that China and USA have no extradition arrangements. Not just USA, but also Great Britain and Canada and a number of other countries. So if you have a fugitive offender who's committed an offense in the USA, but is not hiding somewhere in Shanghai, you cannot have that guy brought back for trial in your country, and vice versa. And yet, Hong Kong and USA have this extradition arrangement. The mouse has it. The elephant doesn't have it. And we have it because of the express blessing from Beijing. Otherwise, Hong Kong can never reach an agreement of that kind. This foreign affairs, nothing to do with us. That's still completely controlled by Beijing under the basic policies regarding Hong Kong. And that is because both the USA and Hong Kong respect the legal and judicial systems of the other. Whereas you have no confidence in the legal and judicial systems of China. That's why you want to protect your people's interests, their rights. And you refuse to reach an extradition agreement with China. And as for Hong Kong, we too have no confidence in the legal and judicial systems of China. Their own leaders appreciate that. Their leaders also understand that. That is why when I was a member of the drafting committee of the Basic Law, we actually devoted 2 days on this question and the enforcement of judgments in civil cases. Now that one was easy, right? But this one is difficult. So whereas experts on their side and the 3 lawyers on our side reach complete understanding over this rendition arrangement, it's called rendition because it's between 2 territories of the same country. Extradition would be between countries. Reach agreement, but it's not written into the Basic Law. Because we were hoping that China's legal and judicial system would improve soon, so that Hong Kong people would have confidence in their system, and U.S. government and the British government would have confidence in their system, and then there will be extradition agreements and rendition agreements. So today, anybody living in Hong Kong is safe from the rest of China because of that, because of these protections by refusing to make extradition arrangements with China or mainland China. And that is why Hong Kong is a safe harbor for everybody living or working there. But once the law is passed, and it can be next week or the week thereafter, certainly not later than early July, then things are totally different. Anybody in Hong Kong, not just living in Hong Kong, including foreigners or US citizens living in Hong Kong, no, any visitor to Hong Kong, the moment you're here, you are liable to be arrested by the Hong Kong government on a request from mainland China, from their courts, and have you brought before a Hong Kong court, and then there will be papers lodged before the court to support the application for extradition or rendition to a mainland court. And what is required, the evidence which is required, is of a minimal standard. We call it prima facie standard, so that a witness statement will do. Because once you reach an agreement of that kind, it always says, practically always, prima facie evidence will be sufficient. You cannot have the trial in Hong Kong. The trial is in China, right? So a judge cannot protect you if you're there before Hong Kong court. I can't protect you as a lawyer because the minimum standard is so low. And then once you are in, I mean, everybody here knows what is liable, what can happen to you, to any suspect. We have seen too much of that. He or she will be made to confess before a TV camera to whatever crime they want you to admit to. Think of the CEO of any large US corporation, Facebook, Google. If one of them, the senior management, is brought back to China and they say, give us your trade secrets or you'll face trial for whatever offense. There are too many cases of concocted offenses. They just concoct a case against you. Then what? How do you protect the trade secrets? And so this bill is going to be terrible for Hong Kong. Some years ago, I came here. I raised another issue. It's called the Article 23 legislation, because Hong Kong is required by the Basic Law, which is our mini constitution, to legislate, to prohibit acts like treason, sedition, and theft of state secrets. So this is our obligation. And in the year 2003, the Hong Kong government proposed, in fact, at the end of 2002, this bill, right, to do exactly that. But what is wrong about that bill was it would have seriously impinged three of our basic and fundamental freedoms: of the press, of religion, and of assembly. That's why we opposed. And we could not have resisted it because we were in the minority. But then there came a statement from the White House saying that the US government was opposed to that bill and calling on the Hong Kong government to establish democracy in Hong Kong as soon as possible. Once I got that, I immediately talked to the British Consul General, and he came up with a statement also supporting us. And then Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Europe. And that encouraged the Hong Kong people, so that on the 1st of July, 2003, which was the 6th anniversary of Hong Kong becoming part of China again, over 500,000 people took to the streets. And that caused the chief executive at the time, C.H. Tung, first to postpone the bill and then withdraw it. So it was actually withdrawn. So even today, there's no such law. But if they pass this thing, they will immediately bring Article 23 back again. Now, in fact, this thing is much more damaging to Hong Kong than Article 23 legislation. Because if treason is there, okay, let's say they try me for treason, right? First of all, I don't think the Hong Kong government will concoct a case against me, not in Hong Kong. But even if they do, I'll be tried by a Hong Kong jury. I think I'm pretty safe with the Hong Kong jury. If it is a trump-up charge. If it's a genuine charge, of course, they convict me. Right? But here, on this one, they don't charge me in Hong Kong. They bring me back to China, and I'll be tried there. And you have read the news about tycoons and people, the bookshop people, being spirited away to China, right? But now, with the passage of the bill, they would do it legally. Legal abduction of.
Could you comment on a legal aspect of this?
Yes.
Because this issue arose, at least in part, because of the murder of a Hong Kong citizen by another Hong Kong citizen in Taiwan while they were on a visit there.
Right.
And the accused murderer is now back in Hong Kong. Under Hong Kong law, can a Hong Kong citizen, with compelling evidence that supports it, return an accused criminal to Taiwan, for example, without an extradition treaty?
Good question, because this is the pretext of the Hong Kong government as to why they must now make amendments to our law and do it quickly. This guy, Mr. Chen, a young guy, took his girlfriend to Taiwan and murdered her and took money from her using a credit card and so on back in Hong Kong. So he committed murder in Taiwan and other commercial fraud cases in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong court, therefore, has jurisdiction dealing with his minor charges, to which he pleaded guilty. He also admitted in a confession statement made to the police about the murder in Taiwan. But the Hong Kong courts at the moment do not have jurisdiction to try him for murder. They only tried him, actually he pleaded guilty to those other minor offenses, for which he was imprisoned for, I think about 2 years. I'm not very sure. 29 months, right, thank you. And because he had been in custody for some time already, he would soon be released. Hence the urgency, says the government. All right. Now, it is true that at the moment, under our laws, the Hong Kong courts cannot try him for murder, even though he already admitted to it. But it can be easily done, because the government is now changing such laws in a great scale. All right. But they can do it on a much smaller scale. And that is simply to pass legislation to enlarge the jurisdiction of the Hong Kong courts by giving it extraterritorial jurisdiction over murder. All right? And you could actually put a sunset clause in the law so that you would only do it for this case, and then the law would then expire. So that would enable the Hong Kong court to have jurisdiction to try him for murder, to which you already admitted, again amending the law, but it doesn't have this damage to U.S. citizens and other people who are in Hong Kong. Okay? Or, again, you can have a case-by-case legislation, simply extending it on a case-by-case basis between Hong Kong and Taiwan. Nothing to do with mainland China. Again, it can be done. But the Hong Kong government doesn't do either of these and claim that there is a loophole which must be plugged. But there's no loophole. As I said, even the Chinese leaders realize their rule of law is not up to standards. That's why they tolerated the state of affairs for so long. And we know that their systems, the legal and judicial systems, have not improved over the years. Nobody has told me, either in Hong Kong or here, that China's systems have now improved so that it's now at par with the rest of the world. They can't claim that. Right? So our Chief Executive Carrie Lam then says, let's do it quickly to make sure we can keep him in prison and then can try him in Taiwan for murder. But this is the pretext, because there's no urgency. What is most important now is the Taiwan government has now spoken. The Taiwan government says, look, if you change your law, it is on the premise that Taiwan is part of the PRC. And Taiwan said, we will have none of that. All right? All right? And we don't want this guy if it is on that basis. So even if you pass a law, we are not going to apply. So where's the rush? And yet they want to do it quickly. Now, but Ambassador, you look at the big picture. Let me put it to you this way. They are now still negotiating over trade only. But in the meantime, mainland China will be stealing a march on this one. And while you're still negotiating over trade, they would have the law already changed in Hong Kong. Right? And they could just have US citizens and other people brought back to mainland China for trial already. While you're still. So why should you overlook that? It is only relevant to a mouse, but in a way affects you because you have the people there, living there. And I think the US government would be very stupid and guilty of negligence by continuing to negotiate with China at the macro level and allowing this thing to happen at the micro level, which affects your people adversely. It will be one up on you. And get a number of important citizens in Hong Kong, or when they're visiting Hong Kong, and they have more bargaining chips over here.
We need to provide an opportunity for our participants here to also ask you some questions. But I would like to just quickly ask whether you agree with a very small question that I would put forward. I was ambassador in China for 4 years, and I've worked on China policy for a long time. And at no point was our policy intended to change the domestic political system in China. It was always designed to pursue a more narrowly focused American interest. But my perception is that there is indeed strong pressure in China for political reform. And the reason why we see fear and repression reemerging in China, even though that decreased during much of the reform and openness policies, but now it seems to be increasing. And the reason it's increasing is precisely because China's openness to the outside world, not U.S. policy, has instilled attitudes in the rising Chinese generation, which they would like to see China's political system modernized, and not simply its economy, its military, and its social structure, all of which have occurred as a result of the success of the reform and openness policy. So that we are seeing the repression, but we're not paying attention to what they're repressing. And what they're repressing are these pressures of the Chinese people, which are the most effective pressures for modernization of China's political system. So the real question for U.S. policymakers is, does a policy of hostility toward China and of seeing China only in its capacity as a strategic rival of the United States, but failing to understand how cooperation with China, not designed to change China's internal political system, but designed to pursue cooperative areas of common interest, will in fact increase those pressures? Because my own sense is the type of repression we see in China now cannot succeed under conditions of openness to the outside world, which China has to continue because it has a globalized economy. So what I'm putting to you is, while it's important for Hong Kong to raise your smaller interests, it's also important for Hong Kong to help our policymakers to understand what is the most effective way of pursuing our interests with China in ways where the collateral consequences of our actions also enhance U.S. value?
It's another question which is impossible to answer shortly or at all, because it involves so many conflicting factors. But I suppose it has.
You have to study socialism and Marxism so
Oh,
you can
yeah,
understand the correct handling of contradiction.
And I'm not a learned man in that regard at all. But I'll try. It's certainly difficult because the Chinese leaders will say to you, "Hey, mind your own business, right?
Yeah.
And don't interfere with China's internal business. That's Hong Kong." Now, first of all, your response ought to be, "Wait a minute. Why did you involve us, U.S. government? Why do you want us to support your joint declaration with the British?" Because that's precisely what happened. The joint declaration between Britain and China was first announced on the 26th of September 1984. And I was surprised that immediately after the announcement, the U.S. government came out openly and applauded. Same with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and European countries. I was scratching my head because I was not in the Executive Council. I didn't know why. All right? Later on, Ensign Chen told me why. It was because both the Chinese and the British governments lobbied hard for international support of their own agreement. It's an agreement between two countries. But they wanted the world to support it so that the emigration tide from Hong Kong would subside. So with the international support like that, the emigration tide did subside. And Hong Kong people then say, "Okay, good agreement." Right? And I also said, "Good agreement," because they also took into account a number of my suggestions, like giving us, like establishing the Court of Final Appeal in Hong Kong instead of Beijing, allowing us to continue to use the common law and not the mainland system, and allowing overseas judges to be invited to sit in the Court of Final Appeal. I was working behind the scenes for that. So I was supportive of it, all right? But I know it's going to be difficult. So, but they did involve the international community to support the one country, two systems. And your government still does. So how can they tell your government to shut up? Your government's response should be, "Hey, you asked me to support you on the one country, two systems. We went all the way further than the other countries by actually legislating in Congress in 1992, this U.S. Hong Kong Policy Act, which makes sure that Hong Kong will be treated as a separate entity from China according to the wishes of China." See? So first of all, don't let them just ask you to mind your own business. You wanted us to mind your business, now we do. Now, so of course, any leader will tell you, "Let me reform in my own way." And I think there's a lot of merit in that. But didn't your government exactly do that? When Xi Jinping took over as the president of China, the general impression is that we are dealing with a reformer now. How many in the States will now consider him to be a reformer? So you gave him every opportunity. Relationship was good between the USA and China. Things were peaceful in China. And that would be the time for these reforms to be at least started. Not only that, they won't even allow Hong Kong to develop democracy, even though it was promised in their own basic law. The basic law says democracy in Hong Kong will develop gradually. But by 10 years, that is 10 years after the handover, that means 2007, we could reach that ultimate goal of having universal suffrage for the election of the chief executive and all members of the legislature. This is 22 years now. Where is that? Okay? So that is the way. You gave Xi Jinping a number of years He has no plan for China to be democratic, not even starting. And he wants to destroy any development of democracy, even in Hong Kong, in spite of the promises. That is why your focus should be directed to the little mouse. At least let's see the democratic mouse before we give you much more time to develop democracy in this elephant.
Let's go to questions.
Thank you. Well, we have, I think, a cumulative 165 years of wisdom on these issues here that I'm sure you'll want to avail yourselves of. Yes, sir.
Hi, Tim Nelson, State Department. Thank you very much for bringing the big picture to us and the concerns of China's understanding of autonomy for a different system in Hong Kong. And I wonder, on the extreme opposite side, Beijing's view of autonomy seems to be not quite a clear understanding of autonomy. So you have a place called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and you have 3 million people in concentration camps and a mass surveillance police state. And recently I read a report that Hong Kong actually sent police to study what's going on in Xinjiang. My question is, does Beijing understand autonomy? And why is Hong Kong studying police tactics in Xinjiang?
Very good question, but perhaps I should actually thank Secretary of State Pompeo in coming up with a strong statement defending Hong Kong's rule of law and so on yesterday, I think within 5 hours after seeing us. This is a very interesting question, because a lot of people would say, all right, Tibet is one thing, Xinjiang is one thing, Hong Kong is a separate thing. Hong Kong is indeed called a special administrative region. But the answer to your question is, China understands autonomy very well. It's autonomy with Chinese characteristics. All right? And so, in the year 2014, in June, the Chinese State Department published a white paper in 7 languages to say that the central government has comprehensive jurisdiction over Hong Kong. Comprehensive jurisdiction over Hong Kong on the part of Chinese central government. How does that sit with a high degree of autonomy, which was promised and already given to Hong Kong under the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law? So they're changing. So it is good to bring that to our attention. Are they planning Hong Kong to go down that route? You see, that is a problem. I talked to some people to understand what's happening to the Uyghurs. And apparently they want to just wipe out their language and other things so that it's just hang, hang, H-A-N, all right? No other religions or ethnic minorities in China. And if they're doing it to the Uyghurs, are they already looking at Hong Kong? And if so, then I suppose they will get rid of the Cantonese that we speak. All right, that will come. I think we
also Han.
yeah, but they don't like it. It's a question of degree, isn't it? And I always remind myself of Martin Niemöller, the German pastor who said after the end of the Second World War, when the Nazis came, they first came for the communists. I didn't speak up for them because I wasn't a communist. And so on and so on. So Hong Kong people must wake up. And U.S. government must wake up. They're doing this slowly, gradually, but autonomy, to them, the objective is to give you some autonomy, which we can control. Comprehensive jurisdiction. Right? They will continue to say one country, two systems. Of course, they will say it. But I will add with Chinese characteristics. And we have to be careful, otherwise,
You were actually the Hong Kong John Adams, because in 1966-67, you defended the leftist workers, communist workers in Hong Kong, against the efforts of the British authorities to suppress them.
successfully.
Is that accurate? Yes.
Adams was successful at the most.
I was successful so that my client was a coolie, carries things, a coolie. And so the whole trade union of coolies, wanted to carry me on their shoulders to go to Beijing. I said, no, thank you.
Hi, I'm Minky Worden from Human Rights Watch. I wanted to ask you to drill down in a little more detail on the timetable and you mentioned a wake-up call. Is it a time for a wake-up call on the extradition law that has been presented by Chief Executive Carrie Lam? And what is the precise timetable on that? And legislation is introduced around the world all the time. Legislation is withdrawn. Is this something that was a bureaucratic mistake, the failure to consult widely, including with U.S. business? The American Chamber of Commerce has made a strong statement condemning the legislation. Is this, in your judgment, is it possible for the legislation to be withdrawn on the basis that it wasn't adequately socialized with the international community?
Of course, any bill which is not yet enacted, that's why it's called a bill, can be withdrawn. And every government, every parliament or congress in the world would have seen that regularly. You can always withdraw the bill and then renegotiate. And on this one, because it's so complicated, if you really want to change, it will involve massive consultation. And it will involve discussion, certainly between the Hong Kong government and Beijing. Because the Hong Kong government has a primary duty to defend our system. But instead, I'm here defending it. Why should I? Nothing to do with me. I'm just a citizen. Right? But our chief executive is not only not defending, but she is pushing this bill through, which would destroy our core values so fundamentally. So the timetable is flexible, but she herself said that she wanted to get the whole thing over before the early part of July at the latest. And since they are now discussing in Hong Kong as to whether or not they would do a very unprecedented thing, which is to forget about the Bills Committee stage. Now, under our system, which is based on the British parliamentary system, once a bill is introduced to Parliament, and in our case, the Hong Kong legislature, it will be committed to a committee of legislators to study it closely in details and discussing whether amendments should be put through and so on and so on. When that's all finalized, there is a report, and then the bill goes back to the whole council for debate and to vote on. But on this occasion, the bill was already committed to a Bills Committee, but now they try to take it back and send it back to the council without wasting any time there. So legislators would have no time to study and argue on the bill and just get on and pass it, right, quickly. And that can be done in a week or 2 weeks. And while they are still negotiating on China trade.
We had Tony, Michael, Mike.
Hi, thank you for a great presentation. I'm Tony Kane. I'm retired, so no affiliation. I was interested in your focus in talking about this bill on the British Sino Declaration rather than the Basic Law. And I wonder if you could expand a little bit on the relationship between the two. And let me just add that I asked the question because certainly in Beijing, Xi Jinping is still saying Hong Kong should be a positive example for the other little mouse, Taiwan, in reaching some kind of agreement with Beijing. And how does those questions affect that, and is that something that can be used in negotiating on this issue?
I will answer the second question first. I still have in my mind's eye this picture when Chen Shui-bian won his first presidential election in Taiwan many years ago. 2000. And there was a long table like that, and the mics were all put here on one end of it, and the results were coming in. It was televised in Hong Kong live. And then his KMT opponent conceded. And then Chen Shui-bian rushed to this long table at this end. He sat down. First thing he said, "One country, two systems is not for me." And later he said he won that election and he won the subsequent election thanks to Beijing, threatening Taiwan with missiles all pointed towards Taiwan. Hong Kong is supposed to be a successful story of one country, two systems, so as to make the Taiwan people interested in the same model. In fact, Beijing, Deng Xiaoping was quite ready to give Taiwan people more. It's still one country, two systems, right? But, and that is one country, two systems, Taiwan people ruling Taiwan with a high degree of autonomy, but they've got something more than we have. The Taiwan government can keep its army, navy, and air force. So I said it's like a man and a woman going to bed, each carrying a gun. I don't know how it will work out. All right. Never tried that.
That's the American tradition.
So Hong Kong is clearly not a successful story for Taiwan. Now, the Basic Law and the Joint Declaration. Of course, there is the Joint Declaration first, before you can have the Hong Kong Basic Law. Because without the Joint Declaration, only the new territories in Hong Kong, which was under a 99-year lease with the British government, would expire on the 1st of July, in fact, should be on the 27th of June, 1997. All right? So without that treaty, Hong Kong was ceded to the British forever under the first unequal treaty. And Kowloon, the Kowloon Peninsula, south of Boundary Street, was also ceded to Britain for good. It's only the new territories which were on a lease. So without the Joint Declaration, only the new territories would be given back to China, all right? And any basic law would not be the Hong Kong Basic Law. It would be the new territories Basic Law, all right? And so the relationship between the Joint Declaration, which involves Hong Kong, Kowloon, and the new territories, and the Basic Law is like an international agreement reached between two countries. And then one of the countries, like the PRC, would use a domestic legislation to implement the treaty obligations as a matter of international law. That would be, so the Basic Law is a local domestic legislation on the part of China to implement that policy. In fact, it's China's own basic policy. What is interesting about the Joint Declaration was first paragraph simply says it is the aspiration of all the Chinese that the Chinese government shall resume the exercise of jurisdiction over Hong Kong, Kowloon, and the new territories on the 1st of July, 1997. Paragraph 2 is the British government will hand back Hong Kong to China on the 1st of July, 1997. That would be enough. But the third paragraph is China's basic policies regarding Hong Kong, that on the resumption of sovereignty over Hong Kong, it will adopt the following policies. And it's all spelled out in 12 subparagraphs there. So China chose on her own to spell out her own basic policies regarding Hong Kong in this international treaty, which is registered with the United Nations. And then the number 12 of clause 3 says China will enact a basic law for Hong Kong, which will implement China's own basic policies regarding Hong Kong. So there's twofold. First, the joint declaration in which they already lay out their own policy, and also promising there that they will actually enact the basic law to carry that out in Hong Kong. And I was involved in that stage. Right? So, but what's interesting is, a couple of years ago, the Chinese officials actually said that the joint declaration is no longer relevant because they already got Hong Kong back, you see. So, but that is, Great Britain is a signatory to that, and the joint declaration still contains China's basic policy regarding Hong Kong, which will be kept alive for 50 years, right? So you can't say that. But that is the important thing. They try to renege even the international agreement now. We mustn't allow that to happen.
My name's Michael Yehuda, and I'm now at GW. Martin, we last talked, I think it must be about 20 years ago, something like that. And ever since then, but perhaps even earlier, Hong Kong has been subject to more and more constriction. Do you see any possibility that this could end other than through some kind of confrontation? As you say, you want Hong Kong to wake up. You want the outside world to support it. Now, all of that goes against the grain of the current Chinese leaders' approach to the matter. So, do you see that there is a possibility of, if you like, a peaceful return to autonomy for Hong Kong? And if so, how would that happen, do you think?
Very good question. That would be my short-term dream, which is that China will honor her promises contained in the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law. But why shouldn't it be also the objective of the US government, which still supports the one country, two systems? Why should it not be the avowed object of the British government, which was signatory to the Joint Declaration? I know it's difficult, because for too long, the international community have allowed Beijing to renege on promises made in an international treaty. I have once said in the Legislative Council debate that the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law is a litany of broken promises on the part of Beijing. Why should the international community allow that to happen? I always say it is much easier to protect what you have than try to obtain what you haven't. But we have all been guaranteed these things, all written into the Basic Law. And no government seems to think that it is important that Hong Kong people would be allowed to enjoy all these basic rights and freedoms, or civil rights, if you like. That's what democracy is. They have been sitting back. Some of them said, we'll watch closely. But watching closely, I watch closely when you take my wallet away from me. And you keep on taking it away. So something positive, some action is demanded of these countries. As I say, Hong Kong is the key to China. If you allow Hong Kong to go down the drain, you'll be dealing with a much more difficult dragon.
Martin, last night I was on RTHK radio talking about this, and one of the opponents I faced was one of my former students and prominent politician, Lung Mei Fun, who talks incessantly. You can't stop her and get a word in edgewise. But anyhow, I did my best. One of the things she said is, you pan-Democrats are all immature. you should just not try to absolutely block the bill, but have a discussion about how to improve it. And that she herself, she claimed, had improved it by getting 9 laws removed from the list of laws for which extradition would be allowed. Of course, the Hong Kong Bar Association made clear that those 9 are useless because there's ways around that you could still extradite businessmen under that. But then others among us who write in the local press in Hong Kong have pointed out there could be ways a rendition bill would be okay. One would be to impose the Hong Kong Bill of Rights standard as a condition for its application. Another would be to have it not apply to local Hong Kong residents at all, which is the standard practice overseas. The British also imposed the European Convention on Human Rights as a standard by which any extradition from Britain would be allowed. And the courts don't have the limited power that this bill provides, but the more serious power to obstruct it. Would that be an acceptable path, or is it just completely impossible given the position the government has taken?
Well, there are a number of workable options. The bar has proposed one, as I said, is to give Hong Kong courts extraterritorial jurisdiction and so on. They're all workable. They're all preferable to this one. This one is, it just opens the Pandora box. And oh, by the way, Michael, I'm glad that I was not one of your students. Otherwise, I'll be speaking on the other side. So, and what is the point of taking away 9 offenses which would be covered, would be subject to extradition arrangements? Because the business people in Hong Kong objected. And why? For good reason. Which businessman doing business in China would not have given a bribe at one stage or another and remain successful in business? There could be some large corporations, I dare say. If they really want your business, because they can't find any other company to supply such products, I believe they will let you alone. Or if you insist, they may leave you out. Yes, I agree, there are exceptions, no doubt. All right? And there could be quite many exceptions when it comes to US corporations. But Hong Kong businessmen doing business in China, I don't see that possible. So they're frightened, of course. So what your former student did was, okay, because they're worried about their business people, so they're worried about commercial crimes things. All right, take out those 9, which are related to commercial frauds and other crimes. But they don't. What about corruption? It's not excluded. See, that's the problem. And even if you exclude corruption, even if you exclude rape or whatever, let's say there's only one offense, murder. Suppose including attempted murder, including conspiracy to murder, they will get you in on that trumped up charge of murder. They say, actually, conspiracy to murder is very beautiful because you don't even need the body. All right? Conspiracy, agreement to murder. The crime is already constituted. There doesn't have to be a body. You see? Then they say, on this hotel, they conspired to murder this person. And now one of the conspirators said, mea culpa, I'm sorry I did wrong, but he also was in it. They will get you in. So it's useless. You have to forget about this bill altogether, rather than to amend it here, amend it there, and take away one offense, take away 2 offenses. Yeah.
Thank you. Robert Keatley, retired journalist, and among other things, former editor of the SCMP. You've noted, as many say, China's trying to make or Hong Kong into just another Chinese city. But my question is it more complicated than that? Would China want Hong Kong to remain separate from the mainland in economic, commercial, in other ways, not political? So what is the goal or the image that Beijing has for what it would like Hong Kong to be?
Hong Kong was likened to a goose which lays golden eggs. I think the leaders of China now would like that goose to continue to lay golden eggs, and maybe even platinum eggs, but entirely obedient. Right? So they don't even have to put a noose around its neck. The goose would anticipate what the leaders want, and the goose will do it. And the goose will think that China wants this extradition thing to be done, and the goose will do it. So they want to have the cake and eat it. They certainly would like Hong Kong to remain a capitalist system, within the capitalist system, and need not go down the socialist way. All right, and they want Hong Kong to continue being a financial center. They want the Hong Kong courts to have the reputation internationally as being independent and completely free from interference. And yet, at the same time, they want the Hong Kong courts to produce only judgments which the party is happy with. Is that? You're quite right. It's more complicated. But if you want the courts to be independent so that other countries joining this One Belt, One Road would be happy to have the disputes settled or arbitrated in Hong Kong, they want Hong Kong to continue to have this reputation. And yet, Xi Jinping, more than 10 years ago, when he was only deputy president of China, came to Hong Kong and said openly that our judges must cooperate with the government. And although he says he wants to rule China by law, he made it quite plain that the courts are there to support the party. It's quite clear. He said so, right? So China wants Hong Kong to continue to prosper, and yet with all our freedoms being turned into freedoms with Chinese characteristics. That's what they want. Control, in other words.
Thank you, Martin Lee, Ambassador Roy. Thanks to all of you and everybody watching online. I've actually had emails from several people watching in Hong Kong, and so we've reached beyond this room. Thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to help us understand what's going on in Hong Kong. 谢谢。